All right, here we are. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Seattle's Civ War Legacy on this Boxing Day, post-Boxing Day edition. Tonight, I am really proud and happy to welcome Dr. Kenneth Noe. Am I pronouncing that right? Noe, or is it Noe?
You are?
It is Noe. Kenneth Noe, who
Dr.
is
Noe.
much warmer than we are in Seattle this evening. Tonight's topic is going to be some wonderful scholarship that Dr. Noe has done in his book, The Howling Storm, which is on weather, climate, and more about the Civil War. So I know weather is very much in the forefront of us here in the Seattle area in Western Washington tonight. So it's a timely topic. So Dr. Noe, why don't you give us a little intro on your background, your teaching background, and other books you've written prior to The Howling Storm?
Sure. I grew up in Virginia. I'm old enough to barely remember the Civil War centennial, so I guess I've always been interested in the Civil War, although there were periods in my life when I actually studied other things. But I left Virginia for grad school, attended the University of Illinois for my PhD, and now 31 years later, we moved back to Champaign, so that's been interesting as well. My early work was on Appalachian Civil War history. My first book was on Southwest Virginia, which is the area that I grew up in. But over time, I really got interested in common soldiers and their experiences. What were they fighting for? What were they not fighting for in some cases? And that led me into some interesting topics, including the Battle of Perryville in Kentucky, which I guess until now has been the book I'm best known for. But also my book, Reluctant Rebels, which is about all those Confederates who waited at least a year to enlist before they put on the gray. How were they different? So in sum, I'm really interested in various aspects of the soldiers.
And so your most recent book is The Howling Storm,
Yes.
which you're going to present to us this evening. How did you fall into that particular topic or that line of research? Where did that's the common soldier to then such an expansive, very much not individual topic like that? How did that shift occur, and what led you to being so inclined to want to write and research about that?
I think there are two origins to this book, and the first origin is in my childhood. My grandparents raised me. We had a farm. Weather was really important to us. Mm-hmm. When you're farming, you have to know, is it about to rain? If it is, you have to get the hay in. Is it about to snow? Well, you've got to put the animals up in the barn. I say in the acknowledgments that, my grandparents were never that interested in current events. They usually weren't interested in sports. But when the weather came on, I had to be quiet because it was really vital for them to know what was going to happen, hopefully the next day. So I've grown up in this mindset of the weather being really important to me, and yet I never really made the connection between the weather and how it might be important to understanding the Civil War until the late 1990s, when I was recruited to write about Perryville. And I knew a little bit about Perryville. I certainly wasn't an expert at that point. And one of the first things I realized I had to deal with in understanding that battle was the fact that it took place in a drought. A terrible drought that shaped the entire campaign, shaped lines of march. The battle itself began on the morning of October 8th as a fight for water. So there I was trying to understand troop movements and generals' decisions and the experiences of common soldiers, but always in this context of drought. And that started to influence how I understood the Civil War in general. I started looking for that environmental context in other aspects of the war, and especially it started to filter into my teaching.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I, even as being a lifelong student of the war itself, is you think of weather as muddy marches and swollen rivers, and that's kind of the for the casual student of the war, kind of ends there. And I really appreciated how the scope of what you're going to present tonight gives us such a a picture of it in totality that is, once you realize it, you kind of can't get it out of your head. Like you were just saying about Perivale, you see it this way, and then you see these causes that are underlying so many things. So I hope as we get started here, I know that's been the big takeaway from my following of what you've presented with this book, is seeing a different layer to things than I knew was even available, honestly, because this wasn't really presented before. Whether it's, like I said, just an afterthought of a swollen river that an army couldn't get across, and that's kind of it. But it's so much more than that. So those that are watching tonight, enjoy. Dr. Noe's gonna do what, about a 30-minute PowerPoint? Is that how?
About 30 or so.
Yeah, about 30 minutes, so not too long. And then I'll put up a banner here across the bottom of the screen. And if you guys have any questions or comments when he's done with the PowerPoint, we'll have time that we can answer specific questions for you guys. But we'll save those for the end, so we can just get going and let him tell us all about the war. And I'm going to sit back with the rest of you guys and watch this. So Dr. Noe, I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint now.
Okay.
And if you can see and our audience can see, looks good to me. I guess we'll just get going. I'm going to go into the background here and just watch the comments. And then when you're done, I'll come back up and present some of the questions or comments people have.
Okay.
So, all right, everybody, enjoy Dr. Noe's presentation here. And I will be back in a half an hour because I'm going to watch right along with the rest of you.
Very good. So first of all, thanks for tuning in tonight, 2 days after Christmas. I really do appreciate it. I should tell you, now that I live in East Central Illinois again, that I'm surrounded by Chicago Bears fans. And so I don't know if I took my life in my hands tonight, but I did decide to redo my PowerPoint in Seahawks colors. Seemed appropriate. The Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. Let me start with what may seem an odd point, but for me, it's a great way to start talking about this project. And that's the title. I have written or edited 8 books, and 4 of them actually have titles I like. Presses, for various reasons, will come in, they'll change a title, they'll want something that's more marketable or something that makes sense. They're pros, they're usually right. But you still have to come up with the title. And I think it's really interesting that I wrote this book. I wrote a 1,200-page manuscript. Initially, this was supposed to be a 2-volume book. And yet I got to the end, I was doing the final editing, and I still didn't have a title. Every time I came up with one, it popped up on a book. My gosh, there goes my title. So I was sort of desperate there at the end, trying to think about what I'm going to call this book. Until one day when I was doing my final edit, and I ran across this quotation. There on the right, that's Henry Kidd Douglas, at the time, aide to Stonewall Jackson. At the end of the 7 Days Battles in 1862, actually on the night of Malvern Hill, the last and the bloodiest of those 7-day battles, it started to rain. It poured that night. It was a terrible experience for the Federal Army that was trying to retreat. It's also a terrible experience for those who were left on the battlefield. And Henry Kidd Douglas wrote this: the howling of the storm, the cry of the wounded, the groans of the dying, the glare of the torch upon the faces of the dead, or into the shining eyes of the speechless wounded, looking up in hope of relief, the ground slippery with a mixture of mud and blood, all in the dark, hopeless, starless night. Surely it was a gruesome picture of war at its most horrid show. And it struck me as I read that passage for probably the 25th time that that's really what this project was about. That's really what I was trying to understand when I started the research 11 years earlier. That the Civil War was not just fought in blood, it was fought in mud. It was fought sometimes under those dark, hopeless, starless skies. And that we had made a mistake in succeeding generations divorcing the war from the environment in which it took place. Now, what do I mean by that? The first time I ever gave a talk on this topic was at the University of Georgia many years ago. And I thought I would begin with a joke. So I got up in front of a group of distinguished historians and I said, the Civil War was fought outside. And I waited for somebody to laugh. And nobody did. Because they took my comment seriously. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought I should too. It is a serious comment. The Civil War was fought outside. It was fought on grass, in mud. It was fought by men crossing rivers. It was fought in the cold. It was fought in the snow, sort of snow that you're experiencing in the Northwest right now. It was not fought in a classroom or in our warm, cozy dens. It was not fought by people sitting in recliners in front of the fire. And yet sometimes we act like it was. When we see a general who's unable to move his army 20 or 25 miles in a day, say George McClellan, it's very interesting. It's very easy, rather, to attribute that to his timidity, his petulance, his character, his cowardice even. And forget the fact that moving 100,000 men, wagons, horses, mules, caissons, guns, through some of the deepest, stickiest mud in the United States really wasn't so easy. Soldiers knew that. McClellan knew that. Increasingly, I think Abraham Lincoln didn't know that, or at least didn't want to accept that. We can talk about that later if you want. But that's what we've lost in forgetting about the environmental context, the weather context of the war. And the whole purpose of this book was to go through the war again. I mean, I started at Fort Sumter, I go all the way to Appomattox and beyond, and to put it back into the environment and to see if that changes the story. And I think it does change the story. I really do. Now, one thing I do in this book, and one thing that I hope you keep in mind if you start thinking about the Civil War in that sort of context, is the idea of agency. Agency is a notion that environmental historians rely on. It's not something that Civil War historians tend to talk so much about. But environmental historians will argue that the weather has agency. That doesn't mean it has a brain or an agenda or battle plan. Of course not. But it is an active player. So one of the things I do in this project, especially at the beginning and the end, is that I find it helpful to think about the Civil War as not that classic contest between blue and gray, but to think of three contending powers: the blue, the gray, and the weather. The weather as a non-aligned power that usually was allied with the Union cause, but not always. It wasn't reliable. It would switch sides, change alliances. And if we think about soldiers in both armies contending with the weather and the environment, as well as their enemies, I think it gives us a more accurate portrait of what their experience was like. So, two key concepts I would stress. The Civil War was fought outside, not in our classrooms or our basements or our dens, but out in the weather, out in the cold, out in the sleet, out in the heat, out in the dust, and that the weather was an active player. It had a role in shaping the course of the war. As we were talking about a few minutes ago, I first got interested in this writing about Perryville, because again, Perryville took place in a drought. And so I wasn't exactly sure how to approach that at first. I didn't know anything about droughts. Why was there a drought in the West in the late summer of 1862? As I was writing that book, I was also teaching. I think it's a great example of how our teaching and our research can constantly reinforce and affect each other. I would go to the classroom and I would talk about Perryville, and I'd have to mention the drought. And if I'm going to mention the drought at Perryville, then you also have to mention the incredible rainy late winter and spring of 1862, flooding at Fort Henry, flooding on the peninsula. And what about Lee's retreat? And what about the incredible heat during Jubal Early's attempt to take Washington? More and more, I found myself in the classroom talking about the Civil War in the context of the weather. And what I would usually do at some point in my class is I would say something like, someone should write a book about Civil War weather. And with one exception, which I'll talk about in a minute, nobody really did. So after all those years of saying someone should do it, I got up one morning and I was sitting at breakfast trying to think about what I wanted to do for my next project. And it just struck me that if no one else was going to, maybe I could. I'd had one basic geography/weather class. I'd grown up farming. I had a cornfield that died in a drought once. Maybe I was the person to do it. Now, some of you are already saying, wait a minute, I know about some aspects of weather in the Civil War. And of course you do. Lots of people have written about aspects of weather in the war. I liken it to those connecting the dots portraits that we sometimes used to do in our coloring books, connect the dots and then color it in. There are a lot of dots out there, and there have been a lot of dots out there for 150 years. What I try to do is connect the dots. And what do I mean by the dots? Well, anybody who goes to a battlefield, Gettysburg there in the upper left-hand corner, anybody who goes to a battlefield is dealing with the weather, even if it's just, gee, it's hot out here on the field today. Or you start thinking about the weather at Gettysburg during the battle, which actually wasn't as hot as most people think. Rufus Dawes, one of my favorite sources in writing this book. Libraries have shelves and shelves and shelves of books about the soldier experience, regimental histories, memoirs, and the like. And a lot of them talk about the weather. It's interesting, when I took my very first Civil War class many years ago, these sources and these discussions of weather were generally disparaged. We want to get to the real stuff. We want to get to the account of the battle. We want to get to the causes. What were they fighting for? But all this talk about weather, that was just in the way somehow. It wasn't in the way for the soldiers. It was really important to them. Battle histories like my Perryville book, and you all have your own favorite one, we'll sometimes talk about the weather context, some scholars more than others, but it's usually there. Books about Civil War soldiers, like Bill Wiley's classic Johnny Reb and Billy Yank. Sure. Bill Wiley talks about being cold, winter clothing, tents, and the like. So it was all there, but so many dots. We see it in popular culture. One of my favorite scenes in Glory is that scene where Morgan Freeman's character is marching back and forth in this terrible rainstorm, a very dark night at Reedville Camp in Massachusetts. And in the audience, we're all waiting to see if the regiment's there the next morning. And of course they are. That scene is powerful if you know it. Down in the lower left-hand corner is my friend Daryl Black. One of the first great authentic Civil War reenactors or living historians. I asked Daryl once, what question do you get the most when you're out doing living history? And without blinking an eye, he said, people ask me, aren't those wool uniforms hot? We have all these dots, but what did it all mean? What does it matter if we put all of this information together? I would argue that it means a lot. And we've expected that for a while. You'll notice a photo of Douglas Southall Freeman, Lee's biographer, later the author of Lee's Lieutenant. Weeks before he died, Douglas Southall Freeman gave his last public speech. And in that speech, It's almost as if he knew he was at the end of his career. He called on the Civil War community to do certain things. He said there are still things we need if we are to understand this war. And one of the things he mentioned was, we really don't know that much about the weather. What was the temperature? What were the conditions that day? You're writing about that march. How hot was it? It seemed hot to the men in the ranks. How hot was it really? Freeman said, we don't have any of that. What we really need is a sustained effort to find that information and put it together, and then we'll have a better understanding of the war. Freeman died in 1953, and nobody did that for decades and decades. The only person who came close, in a book that very much I want to acknowledge, is Robert Crick's Civil War Weather in Virginia. It's really the only attempt to provide what Freeman was asking for. But as Freeman says itself, it's not an analytical book. It's essentially an almanac with some information per day. What Crick discovered, or rediscovered, much to his credit, is that there is a large cache of this information at the National Archives. In the 1840s, the Smithsonian Institution instituted a study. They managed to attract people all over the country to take daily weather readings. And they would actually send them the instruments. And they were supposed to go out 3 times a day, 9 a.m., 2 p.m., 7 p.m., and take weather observations. What's the temperature? What's the sky look like? What's the barometric pressure? What's the wind direction? What's the wind speed? And the idea at the Smithsonian was, in an era long before computers, if we can compile all of this information and put it together, maybe we can start to understand what American weather looks like. And perhaps even more important than that, maybe we can start to understand how weather works. This is an era when no one could accurately predict the weather. No one understood things like cold fronts and warm fronts, much less La Nina, which so many of you are experiencing rather vividly in the Seattle area right now. They collected all of this information. Now, when the Civil War began, observers in the South largely stopped sending information to Washington. They couldn't get it there. But there were a few who kept compiling it. So as it turns out, we actually have quite a bit of detailed information for the Eastern Theater. We have scattered but useful information for the Western Theater. We don't have a lot from the Trans-Mississippi. I'm desperately hoping that if my book does nothing else, it will encourage people to come forward with Grandpa's Diary that has all of these temperature readings from Louisiana or Texas or Western Missouri. But we can sort of put together what weather in the Civil War looked like using these Smithsonian sources as well as military and naval sources. Army surgeons were supposed to collect this data as well, and some of that has survived. Ship's logs in the U.S. Navy were supposed to collect this information. The Navy did a really good job of collecting weather information in the Atlantic. Sadly, not so much in the brown water Navy, up and down the rivers like the Mississippi. But we have information there. And what Robert Crick did was take essentially the information from one of these weather observers in Georgetown, supplemented from time to time by a couple of others, and he got a pretty good sense of what temperatures and wind direction were like every day in Virginia during the war. When I got to National Archives, I discovered there was a lot more out there, and I was able to use that in putting this book together. So it's not just based on qualitative evidence, soldiers writing about the weather, but in a lot of cases, it's based on the hard numbers as well. So what do those numbers tell us? And what do they tell professional meteorologists who frankly know a whole lot more about what to do with this data than I do? I'm a historian, I'm not a weatherman. What they tell us is that Civil War weather, we want to use the technical term, was really kind of weird. It was not normal. We cannot assume that the Civil War was fought in whatever we might define as normal weather conditions, because it wasn't. Weather in this period was strange, unusual. First of all, beginning in about 1845, and lasting through the Civil War years, there was a massive drought in the western half of the United States. It got especially bad in the 4 or 5 years before the Civil War and lasted during the Civil War. Meteorologists refer to this as the Great Civil War Drought. I was amazed when I first ran across that. Meteorologists know all about the Great Civil War Drought. Civil War historians, by and large, had never heard the term. We had no idea that the meteorologists and geographers were talking about a Civil War drought. It's incredibly dry in the West, and it has all sorts of ramifications for Western settlement, for the decline of the Comanche Empire. Doesn't mean it was dry all the time, though. And I have to mention this tonight. In December 1861 and lasting into January 62, there was a massive flood on the West Coast, primarily centered in California, especially around San Francisco down to Sacramento, but all up and down the coast, all the way through modern Oregon and Washington into British Columbia. Once in a 1,000-year storm caused by a series of low pressure systems coming in from the Pacific, the California mega flood or the Pacific mega flood. You are experiencing the snowy version of something like this right now. So why did it begin in December 1861? Why are you suddenly having incredibly unusual snow in the Seattle area in December 2021? A lot of it has to do, as I'm sure you know from your local TV news, a lot of it has to do with the El Nino phenomenon, technically referred to as the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. Right now, in December 2021, as in December 1861, North America is at the beginning of a so-called La Nina year. La Nina, some people refer to it as extreme normal. It's normal conditions times 5. Cold water off the coast of Peru, heat flowing from east to west toward Indonesia, northwestern Australia, waves bringing those temperatures, those currents up into the air, affecting wind direction, the jet stream, affecting weather around the world. La Nina years tend to bring a lot of precipitation to the Pacific Northwest and to Australia and to Indonesia. California gets dry. The U.S. South becomes drier than usual. It's hotter in a La Nina year. You're experiencing that right now. Now, some scholars believed, and some still believe, that there was an extended La Nina throughout the Civil War. More recent exploration, however, suggests that, in fact, conditions changed, that essentially through 1862, through 1864, and the first year of Reconstruction, you're actually experiencing an El Nino year. Easterly winds weaken, the so-called conveyor belt across the Pacific changes direction, temperatures warm up off the South American coast, weather conditions change. El Nino years typically bring drought to the East Indies, to Australia, sometimes bringing monsoon rains, extreme monsoon rains to parts of Asia, India, cold winters in the American South, where most of the Civil War was going to be fought. And so current thinking is that there were 2 important El Nino years during the Civil War and 1 right after. Not so much important to those of you on the Pacific Northwest, but certainly important to folks on the East Coast and to people fighting the Civil War, is that there's another oscillation out there in the Atlantic called the North Atlantic Oscillation. Essentially runs from a permanent low pressure system around Iceland to a permanent high pressure system around the Azores, but sometimes the pressures change. Sometimes the difference between the pressures become more or less. And in a negative North Atlantic oscillation phase, you're likely to get cold winters and heavy snow, heavier than usual snow in the south, as well as in Western Europe. Well, there were negative North Atlantic oscillation years in 1862 and 1864, 1865 again. If you put that El Nino effect together with the North Atlantic oscillation effect, what you get are truly unusual weather conditions. And it's in those conditions that the Civil War was fought. So what does this mean practically? Let me run through a list and show you what I mean. Civil War weather, summer and fall of 1861, probably influenced by La Nina, is hotter than usual across the battle zone. Temperatures over 100 degrees, say at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Men collapsing and falling out of their ranks on the way to that battle and from that battlefield. December of 1861, actually at the beginning of the month was incredibly warm. But then with the coming, probably, I think, of El Nino, comes in December, El Nino, Christ child. It's associated with Christmas time. At the end of December 61, you get snow, incredibly cold weather, the weather that affected Stonewall Jackson, who was pretty confident he could march to Bath and Romney and chase those Federals off, and instead walked into one of the great blizzards of the war. From January into the spring of 1862, it was unusually cold and wet in the South. Cold enough and wet enough that it affected food production. Farmers planted late. What they got into the ground was often washed out. Growth was stunted. And then my Perryville drought, summer and fall of 1862, it pretty much quit raining altogether. That also affected food production because you had this terrible drought that lasted through the second half of the year, really into December. We can talk about the drought and how it affected Perryville, but as late as November, December 1862, William Rosecrans was having trouble of feeding and equipping his army in Nashville because the river is so low because of that drought. Now, what's interesting about this weather pattern is it happens again in 1863. And it sort of happens again in 1864. The drought area just moves north. It moves into the northern states. Still drought in Missouri. There's still drought in Virginia. The entire Overland campaign, the Petersburg campaign in 64 are fought in drier and hotter conditions than usual. But you also have drought in the north to the degree that Democrats were hoping they could use declining food production to defeat Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans in 1864. He sent all of our boys off to war. He's calling for hundreds of thousands of more every time we turn around. Now we have this drought and food production is dropping. I was taught when I was an undergraduate that the North never had to worry about food. They had reaping machines and all this new technology, and King wheat defeated King cotton. And the fact is, the best year for food production in the North was 1862. 1863 was particularly bad because there were early frosts that swept across the northern states, including, here in Champaign County, Illinois, killing frosts as early as August, and then an even larger one in the second half of September 1863, which destroyed half of the food production around here, where I am right now. This is also that system that pushed its way into East Tennessee right before the Battle of Chickamauga. If any of you have ever read about Chickamauga, you know it had been hot and dry for weeks, and suddenly the night before the battle, it got incredibly cold. And there are all those accounts of the wounded the following night, shivering and suffering in the cold. It's the same system. Finally, the cold new year. January 1st or 2nd, 1864, depending on where you were, coldest day of the Civil War. Two massive Arctic fronts that came out of Western Canada, across the American South, all the way down to Florida. Never to be forgotten, especially by, say, James Longstreet's men in East Tennessee, who were mired in snow, many of them without shoes. Flood in the spring, drought in summer and fall, definitely affected food production and led to hunger. One of the things that we've never really talked about as Civil War historians, and we should, in some ways, the Confederacy picked the worst possible time in the 19th century to try to launch an agricultural republic because it was beset by drought and food shortages throughout most of its existence. Throw in the loss of men, escaping enslaved people, the loss of railroads. We can begin to understand why many historians will argue that the Confederacy fell apart from within. But when we talk about all of those things that we usually associate with the so-called internalist school of the Civil War, draft evasion, people avoiding the tax in kind, people who were losing faith in the Confederacy, we usually forget the foundation. The foundation was all of this was happening in the midst of a drought. Confederate Congress really did have to make an incredibly hard decision. Whom do we feed, the Army or the civilian population? And they picked the Army, and the civilian population was none too happy about it. These droughts affect the home front, but weather affects the battlefront as well. In an earlier article that I wrote several years ago, I actually tried to codify how many battles and campaigns were affected by weather. I actually gave that up in the book because I came to the conclusion that in some manner they all were. And this is what Richard was saying earlier about how once you start looking at the Civil War in this way, it's hard not to. It's hard to understand Fort Donelson without understanding the sleet and the snow and the cold weather that shaped that battle, that shaped decisions of commanders. It's hard to understand the retreat from Gettysburg without understanding that, with a couple of exceptions, it rained every day. And we know pretty much exactly how much it rained because one of those Smithsonian weather observers, Michael Jacobs, was in Gettysburg. I always like to point to Michael Jacobs as an example of how amazing these weather observers were. On July 1st, 1863, while Richard Ewell's men were sweeping down his street past his house, he was out there taking his weather readings at 9 a.m., 2 p.m., and 7 p.m. And he continued to do it the next day during the occupation of the town. And so we have all these numbers from Gettysburg. And we have numbers from Washington, Baltimore. We know how hot it was that day in Washington when Abraham Lincoln went out to stare down Jubal Early at Fort Stevens. We also know that the heat on that march was so bad and the dust was so thick that it delayed Early a day. And you might think, well, what's a day? Well, a day meant a lot during the Early raid when he was arriving about the same time that elements of 6th Corps were arriving from Petersburg to defend the city. What if Early had taken Washington, even for a few days? How would that have affected the coming election? How would that have affected? And finally, I've got a portrait here of Sherman's March to the Sea, only to point out that we shouldn't think of only bad weather affecting the Civil War. We should think of good weather as well. One historian once looked at Sherman's march and declared that his biggest ally was what David Ludlam called Yankee weather. The weather for Sherman was perfect. Just enough rain to keep the dust down, just cool enough to keep his men from overheating. When he got to Savannah and was writing Grant and Lincoln, he acknowledged how important the weather had been in the success of the march to the sea. It would have been a different affair had it taken place in the sort of rain and mud that affected his march through South Carolina early in 1865. So we want to think about the importance of good weather as well as bad weather. One thing I'll mention briefly, because it's something I love to talk about, is that we also have to think about the effect of rain or snow when it strikes the earth, when it makes mud. Richard and I were talking about mud at the beginning of our talk. Many Civil War historians are not aware that there are many different kinds of soil around the United States. And there are all sorts of ways to understand that soil, from the most minute local level to broad general characterizations. And in Howling Storm, I use the broadest characterizations possible. You see the 12 soil orders in the United States. And you'll notice there are some pretty unique soils. There's a unique soil in the Pacific Northwest, predominantly. There are unique soils in the Rockies. There are unique soils in the Appalachians. But what always strikes me about the map you're looking at is that orange blotch. That orange blotch is called Altasol. Down south, we call that red clay. You see an example of it to the right. That orange blotch looks a whole lot like the Confederacy. It's not perfect. You certainly don't see it in Florida. You don't see it on the coasts. You don't see it in the Appalachians. It pops up into Pennsylvania and New Jersey. It's hard to see on this map, but there's actually a little finger of red clay Altasol poking up into Pennsylvania. And I assure you, it runs smack dab into Little Round Top. And this is a sticky soil that soldiers often refer to as bottomless. Most soils, water only permeates so far. Horse might get stuck, wagon or caisson might get stuck, but eventually it's going to reach a solid level. You can dig it out. What horrified Northern soldiers throughout the Civil War was that they were fighting by and large in this bottomless soil. I used to read accounts of horses being buried up to their ears, and I didn't believe it. Believe it. It happened. There are more accounts of that than you can imagine. So weather plus soil created conditions that are at least suggested there in the photo on the right. So the last thing I want to say is this, and then I want to go to your questions and comments. There's a book that you see on the left of the screen right now. It's a very important book. It's an important book to me. It's a controversial book, to be sure, but one that affected my thinking a lot. And it's a book by Mike Davis. It's called Late Victorian Holocausts. For many, many years, I taught honors world history. And one of the things you have to teach when you're teaching the second half of world history is the rise of empire, the rise of imperialism starting in the 1850s. How was it that a handful of European nations took over most of the world by 1914? We usually would point to technology, machine guns, steam engines, quinine, or we would point to political ideas or the rise of social Darwinism. Mike Davis pointed out that we'll never understand the rise of imperialism unless we grasp that in Asia, including the subcontinent, including parts of South America and Africa, between 1877 and 1902, something between 30 and 50 million people died of starvation because of El Nino-related famines or floods and the inability or the unwillingness of those imperial powers to do much about it. He says we can't understand the rise of imperialism. We can't understand the shape of the modern world unless we go back to those El Ninos, unless we go back to those droughts and floods. And he calls that the secret history of the 19th century. Now, I don't claim that much for the Howling Storm, but I will argue that it does offer a secret history of the Civil War, an aspect of the Civil War we've never really understood clearly in later generations, that we've forgotten about, shoved aside, as we brought the war indoors, metaphorically. Last picture I'll show you tonight, of course, that's the GAR Cemetery in Seattle, place I've been to myself. Incredibly important site. The men who are buried there, the veterans who are buried in that cemetery, and the other Union veterans who are buried around Seattle, who came west after the war, this history was not secret to them. They understood the importance of the environment, of weather. They wrote about it. They talked about it. They usually agreed. It was just that later generations chose not to listen to that aspect of their stories. And what I would suggest to you is that if we truly want to understand the Civil War, That's what we need to do. We need to listen to that aspect of their story too. Not just the blood, but the mud. So those are my comments. I'm going to close the PowerPoint. And
all right. Can everybody hear me again? You hear me again?
I can sure hear you. Yes.
Okay. So interesting. We didn't have too many questions tonight, but you answered. Ryan was asking if there was truth to the stories of horses and mules sinking into the mud and drowning. And then right at the end, you answered that. So his follow-up comment was that he was really glad to hear that question answered because he never heard a satisfactory answer to that. A couple people asked about lightning. Now, the couple comments here in mentioned there was a specific story about, I guess in the collection now of the Springfield Armory, there's a Model 61 Springfield rifle that had been actually struck by lightning and had damaged the rifle and the bayonet. Have you come across any stories or anything that involving lightning? I mean, they're almost, tales, really, in a way, something like that, as far as not really related to the scholarship, but just interesting things like that you've come across.
Oh, sure.
At all, sure. Or even not even just lightning, but any really oddball stories that you thought, wow, I had no idea that this had happened.
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, lightning. Yes, men were struck by lightning. Men were killed by lightning. Tents were struck by lightning. Bayonets and guns proved to be great conductors of electricity. So, yeah, I won't say there are hundreds of accounts, but there are accounts throughout the war of men being struck by lightning, camps being struck by lightning, fires being caused by lightning, forests burning because of lightning storms. Yeah, I mean, that happened. And everything else you can imagine happened to these soldiers as well. Men drowned in floods. They were burned to death in forest fires. There were at least 4 tornadoes during the war. There's a huge, it's hard to say exactly what it was, whether it was a tornado or something else. But I mean, there's this huge storm that blows up right before the Overland campaign begins. It terrifies men. Their camp accoutrements are flying through the air. So almost anything you can imagine occurred, and almost any negative weather manifestation like lightning will end up sadly killing somebody. Men frozen to death. I kept running across these terrible accounts of men and of animals. One of the things that I do talk about in the book is that the war was horrible for horses and mules. And we tend to think about the horses and mules who were shot to death on the field of Gettysburg because we have photographs of them. But it's clear that something like 1 million animals die in Union service during the war, and most of them die of ill use. And a lot of them die in wintertime because they're trying to pull wagons through snow, mud, slush, ice. It took the South years, decades, 2 decades, to get back to the numbers of horses and mules it had in 1860. So it's a disaster for animals of all kinds, humans included.
Well, you should mention that there's one of my things that most recently, I think the fighting at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania, to me, is the most palpable weather related. I mean, these guys on either side of the earthworks just pounding each other with the butts of the rifles in the mud, and just the level of rain that was occurring that day. And there's practically 24 hours of nonstop hand-to-hand combat. That was the most palpable weather experience during the Civil War that I could understand, as through people's books and things. But recently I was reading, because of one of our veterans right here in Seattle, I was studying him, who was part of Averell's raid in December of 1863 into southwestern Virginia, and the descriptions of what they had to endure with the horses. and how it was basically freezing rain. The roads were covered, the streams were swollen, swimming back and forth across the streams to evade pursuing Confederates. Their ammunition was soaked and useless. They didn't have food. They were starting to run short on shoes and jackets and things because they just lost them through the chaos of this thing. And weather was entirely the determining factor for their experience. And when you read about anything that they say, it's always about the frozen horses, the frozen men, the men that were washed away in streams because they had to swim with their horse parallel to the flow of these fast rushing winter streams, because if they turn them sideways, the horse and the rider went downstream, and that was it. And some of them would drown. And I'm like, this is chaos, and it's violent. It's really a violent affair, but it has nothing to do with a single bullet being fired.
Yes.
But it's the same. It's the same level of casualty and violence and horror and experience and hardship and defeat or victory, because the Confederates didn't achieve anything in capturing them or cutting them off on their retreat. They all made it back to Pennsylvania and Maryland, but the battle was entirely a battle with the weather. Which was I had never really thought of something like that happening.
It's a great example. It's a great example. It was really great in the weather. Yeah.
A question I think that many people have, and this might be just some myth busting that you can do on your part, is I've heard it referred to as concussion theory. This idea that the sound, the acoustics from the artillery or even the musketry of a large scale battle somehow affected the weather, and that's why after so many battles we'd see these torrential downpours or these weather events that stop Meade from pursuing Lee, stop McClellan from pursuing Lee, and on and on and on. It was a thing, and it was a thing in Europe as far as I understand as well. How realistic did they feel that was at the time, and how seriously was that looked into to sort of dispel that idea?
It's a fascinating story. First of all, no. You can shoot a lot of artillery and you're not going to create rain. But it's not until the 20th century that people really understand how weather works. So you can forgive them for thinking so. And it did rain after a lot of battles. It also didn't rain after a lot of battles. But, we tend to remember the exceptional story I've told before. My blessed grandmother would always say that the sky turned dark and it became rainy and terrible every Good Friday, because the earth was mourning the crucifixion. And even as a kid, I started to notice a lot of sunny Good Fridays. But you couldn't convince my grandmother because that's what she believed. In the same way, not only Civil War soldiers, but Civil War generals, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, William Tecumseh Sherman, came to believe that there was a cause and effect between artillery and producing weather. And what happens is, after the war, there are enough accounts of this that people start not only propagating the idea, but experimenting with it. There's actually a guy who writes the first book on Civil War weather named Edward Powers. By the late 1880s, actually gets a federal government grant to prove this. What he really wants is a lot of artillery, surplus artillery, so he can go shoot it all off and create rain. At the same time, he's working with Confederate General Daniel Ruggles, who has the same theory. He's trying to float explosive devices on balloons up into the sky to create weather. Well, all these experiments fail.
Sure.
But they keep trying and trying. And of course, you can go all the way up to what? The Dust Bowl, Great Depression. And you can find people wandering around Kansas, Oklahoma with surplus Civil War era howitzers promising to bring rain. It's a cultural idea. It's based on anecdotal evidence. It's based on flawed anecdotal evidence. It's not going to work. But people believed it for decades.
Yeah. Well, in my final question, now this I'm sure could be a topic, a conversation all of its own for an hour. But is, given what their understanding was of weather and where humans were really in their development of the science and those things at that point, versus religious belief, and that these weather systems could be providential, they could be acts of punishment or reward or so on, that the South would have praised the weather if it worked for them and say preventing the pursuit, or the vice versa. And as I understand it, that rhetoric was certainly more widespread early in the war, when everybody was looking really to have a more holy aspect to their mission, so to speak, in the war. But that kind of fades later as they've just been through the grinder enough that they start really forgetting about that stuff. But maybe you could talk about that a little bit, like how people interpreted the weather, I guess, in that Victorian 19th century understanding of the world and how it works and what God did and didn't do versus nature and so on.
Well, I think it's interesting. And I wondered about the same thing when I was writing the book. And I have a good friend back in Auburn, Charles Israel, who encouraged me to read sermons. There are a lot of sermons that still exist, especially from the Confederacy. 1860 was the high water mark for church attendance in American history. In terms of percentage of the population, it has never been higher than it was in 1860. So they were a church-going population. They assumed that weather was caused by all sorts of things, but certainly God's will was important. And what happens is exactly what you say. In 1861, when weather is great in the South and they're getting bumper crops and the war is going pretty well, by the way, Southern ministers are very quick to point to the weather as an example of God's hand in supporting the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. And then, as you say again, what happens later in the war, as things start to turn against the Confederacy, and as those droughts settle in, especially in 62 and 63, and in Virginia in 64, is that they don't make the logical jump of saying, well, God's angry with us because of these droughts. A few of them do, but by and large, they don't. And it's interesting because they're definitely looking for sin on which to blame defeat. I mean, they're looking for everything from poor treatment of the enslaved people to too many people going to the theater, which is sinful. You'll forget how much sin Abraham Lincoln was committing when he went to Ford's Theater that night. But they don't talk about the weather so much. In terms of the soldiers, I expected to find a lot more of that than I did. And I found some. There's an example I use at the end of the book of an engineer from New York who's writing about the rain and the flooding on the peninsula leading up to the 7 days. And he just wonders, why is God doing this? Why is he doing this to us? We clearly have the just cause. Why isn't he supporting us? There was less than that than I expected. Yeah. But it's certainly there. Yeah. But we're at an interesting cusp in Western history when you do have a population that's starting to think, well, maybe there are scientific causes for this. We just don't know what they are. And actually, I mentioned the Smithsonian study a few minutes ago. I mean, one of the great theories behind starting the Smithsonian project in the 1840s was that there were things out there that we would eventually call warm fronts and cold fronts, and that weather in one part of the country affected weather in another part of the country. They had no way to prove it at that point. But the theory is there. So they're sort of making that transition, and the Civil War takes place in that transition. There's a famous story of a guy who shows up in the White House. In those days, you could just walk in the White House. It's a guy who shows up in the White House and convinces Abraham Lincoln for about 48 hours that he can predict the weather. If he can predict the weather, they can win the war. Lincoln finally concludes he's a charlatan, but he believed it for a couple of days. At least he was hopeful.
Wow. Well, speaking of Lincoln, my final question or idea that I'd like your opinion on is how weather was accepted for what role it did play in determining outcomes. The Meade's pursuit after Gettysburg is, of course, the most widely debated and probably widely known in that case, where weather was a very important factor in it, but it seems to really have been disregarded as a legitimate reason in the time. That now we look at it and we go, well, of course they could, Lee couldn't get across either, and he had time to fortify. And by the time they got there and got over the South Mountain Range and all that, we understand because we understand the weather. But was there any point where the weather became as much a part of their thought as having a case of the slows, like after Antietam? Did they really believe that, or is that something you should have just gone through it? We don't know what it is, but that shouldn't be an excuse for your outcome. Did they ever get some slack for the weather for not being able to accomplish things?
I would answer it this way. I think there were many people who understood the importance in the failure of the Peninsula Campaign, mm-hmm. or the failure of Meade to bag Lee northward.
Yeah.
A lot of soldiers understood that, though not all. I think the commanders on the scene understood that because they understood what it took logistically to move an army in bad weather. I mean, it's true. In 1860, none of those guys had commanded anything larger than a regiment. Suddenly you've got a 100,000-man army behind you churning up the mud. But they understood the reality of moving an army from place to place in heat and dust, or in rain, or in ice and snow. So a lot of them got it. And among the people who understood it well are the people that we've spent 150 plus years saying bad things about. George mm-hmm. McClellan got it. Don Carlos Buell got it. George Meade and his generals on the Potomac, they got it. Sure. They did. The problem was the politicians never really got it. In some ways, the politicians back in Washington were the first armchair generals. Mm-hmm. And as much as I like Abraham Lincoln in all sorts of ways, he's my favorite president, he never really got it. And so you talk about giving these guys slack. He never gave anybody slack for the inability to overcome the weather. There's a very good historian of the environment, Mark Fiji, who has looked at Lincoln a little bit. And he talks about what's called the Whiggish mindset. Lincoln was a Whig. Mm-hmm. Most of those Republicans had been Whigs. The Whiggish mindset was very pro-progress, pro-industry, pro-technology. Weather is something to be conquered, to be tamed, like everything else, like mm-hmm. a river or a mountain. There are ways to overcome the weather, and Lincoln thought that men could overcome the weather. What he found in 1864 was a general who agreed with him, but also a general who understood logistics. And that was U.S. Grant. And one of the key glues in that Grant-Lincoln relationship was their determination that they were going to forge through despite the weather. As Carol Reardon wonderfully points out, it killed tens of thousands of men in the Army of the Potomac. But it was ultimately successful. So did soldiers get it? Yeah. Did a lot of generals get it? Yeah. Did the administration cut them much slack? Not really. Not really. And you could say the same of Jefferson Davis for whatever that's worth.
Yeah.
I mean, Lee can never convince the Confederate Congress to do what? Adequately feed his army. Although there were certainly problems in the South doing that as well.
Yeah. Well, you can see that those critical voices, of course, of McClellan and Meade and so on have resonated so far in history that it also diminished the weather factor because they weren't discussing it. They didn't give it credence in their criticism, and then therefore it takes 150 years before somebody finally, can look at that differently because those voices, what Lincoln had to say is going to override what any soldier was writing in his journal about the weather.
I think that's true.
I think that's dictated how we've looked at it for so long as well.
And I would stress, I'm not the world's biggest defender of George McClellan. I take him to task quite often at other points in the war. But yeah, I mean, generals who pointed out logistical problems dealing with weather and the environment have come down to us in history as chicken excuse makers.
Yeah.
And we glorify the guys who just go charging through no matter what. At the same time that anybody who's in the military now will tell you that it's still hard to move troops through, until recently, the weather and the geography of Afghanistan, for example, where men had to go back to using animals again, pack animals. It's still hard. We got helicopters and Humvees, and it's still hard in 2021, yet supposedly it wasn't hard in 1861.
Yeah. It's an interesting legacy, and I'm certainly thankful for what you've done with your work and to opening my eyes to think about this stuff. And again, the internal versus external debate and where weather fits in that, and the hard choices that were made in the Confederacy, those are all things I hadn't really thought about. But then once you do, you go, oh, well, yeah, of course, that was a massively important thing. And I hope that anybody viewing tonight, if you haven't had the chance to read Dr. Noe's book, or watch other interviews where he's asked different questions, Civil War Institute and Peter Carmichael, I think you were on there maybe last year or year before.
Last May.
Last May. And of course, Peter has some really great questions and concepts around the individual soldier and their relationship with the weather and stuff that is certainly worth watching. So if you want to go on YouTube and look up Dr. Noe. And then, of course, the book, I'll pull it up here. This is the book itself. It can be found anywhere. Do you have a preferred outlet? Do you prefer that we buy it through LSU Press, or is Amazon okay in your book?
Well, some people have mixed feelings about Amazon. But I'm okay. You can buy it wherever you like, really.
Just get it.
Your local bookstore. I'm supposed to point out your local bookstore, or certainly LSU Press, because they were nice enough to publish it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. LSU Press, Amazon. If you have a local bookseller you can order from. Do you have a website or anything that anybody can see all your different titles and condensed, or you?
I do.
Anything like that?
One of the surprising things that happened when I retired was that my Auburn University website disappeared in about 2 weeks, which I didn't expect. But I have put up one now, and it's pretty rudimentary. I'm still working on it, but it's there. It has all my books. KennethWNoe.com. Okay.
Well, good. Well, thank you for joining us tonight, giving us something to do, because we're all snowed in here and nobody can do anything. So it's a good night to talk weather, that's for sure. Not such a good night to be out in it. I think it's about 11 degrees here in Seattle, which is remarkably cold for here at almost sea level where we are.
Whereas it has not snowed here. It has not snowed yet in central Illinois. We are fast approaching the latest first snow in recorded history here. Wow.
Well, I'm sure there's an oscillation from the Arctic that's making us get it and you not. Wish it was more normal. You can have it instead of us, that's for sure. Again, and thanks to all of you guys for tuning in tonight and your comments and questions. We've got viewers from California and Colorado, New Orleans. So everybody's got a little different something weather tonight. So thanks for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Noe, for joining us. I really appreciate you staying up late to entertain us on the West Coast. And
thanks for having me.
All right, guys, have a good night. Take care, and we'll see you next time.